Welcome to our class on Chassidus. We're going to be learning a beautiful Chassidic discourse in the Rebbe. The name of the Chassidic discourse is called Ma Toivu Ayalecha Yaakov. How good and wonderful is the tents of Jacob. The Rebbe said this Chassidic discourse on Shabbos Parshas Balak. That year was the 7th day in the month of Tamuz in the year Tafshin Mem Dalid 38 years ago. So again, the Chassidic discourse is based on the verse in the Torah portion where we have the beautiful blessing of Ma Toivu Ayalecha Yaakov. How great and how good are the tents of Jacob, Mishkanesecha, the dwelling places of Yisrael, of the Jewish people. So Rebbe said it's known, the Chassidic discourse on this verse, from the Kutei Torah, from the Alter Rebbe, on Parshas Balak, which is called the Chassidic Torah portion, at the end of the Torah portion, together with the notes and the footnotes from the Alter Rebbe's grandson, the Tzemach Tzedek. Also, besides the footnotes that the Tzemach Tzedek has on the Alter Rebbe's Chassidic discourse, also in the Torah, which is a classical works of Chassidus from the Tzemach Tzedek, which is printed with a lot of notes and short versions and explanations for this Chassidic discourse, which add new and great ideas. And like Rebbe quotes the verse that says, "Ateres zkenim bnei bonim," the beauty of grandparents as grandchildren. And as we know, the Tzemach Tzedek was the Alter Rebbe's grandson. And especially, it wasn't just a grandson, but he was the Alter Rebbe's daughter's son. And we know the famous story that the Tzemach Tzedek, who again was the Alter Rebbe's grandson through his mother, not through his father. So it's brought down that when they wanted very, very much, and they were demanding, and they ultimately accomplished by the Tzemach Tzedek, they should accept leadership, and they said to him, "You are the preferred grandson of the Alter Rebbe, because not only you're the grandson, but you're a grandson through your mother, the Alter Rebbe's daughter." And it's explained at length, or actually in short, but at length, in the Hayoim Yoim of the Rebbe. So over there in this Chassidic discourse of the Tzemach Tzedek, he brings the insight and the teaching of the Maggid of Mezrich on this verse. And the Maggid has a insight into this verse in his classical works called Torah, and he explains over there as follows. So again, the verse says, "Ma toivu oyalecha," uses the term oyel, a tent, and mishkanesecha, a dwelling place. So the Maggid says that when it says oyel, what does oyel mean, a tent? It means a temporary abode. And like he brings the verse where it says in the prophet, where Hashem says, Aהליך b'oyel, I was just going with you like in a temporary abode in a tent. So that's, the Maggid explains, oyel is referring to a temporary abode. Mishkanesecha, the Maggid says, is referring to a permanent dwelling place. Because Mishkan comes from the word of a shachanti. I'm going to dwell amongst you, and you dwell in a permanent way. So that's what that Tzemach Tzedek brings to the Maggid of Mezrich, that oyel is referring to a short-term, transient place. On the other hand, Mishkan is referring to a permanent place. And based on this, he explains why it says oyalecha. When it says oyalecha, which is transient, he uses who? He used the name for Yaakov. And on the other hand, when it says the term of mishkanesecha, where it's dwelling in a permanent way, it used the name Yisrael. Why is that? Because we know it's brought down in the Zohar. The Zohar says Yaakov is from two words: Yud, the letter Yud, and then A Kabbalah. What does a heel mean? It's referring to the heel. So in other words, it's not the main part of the human being. So you see, when it talks about oyel transient, it uses what's part of the person, the heel, which is not the mainstay of the person. However, when it says Mishkanesecha, what name does it use? It uses the name Yisrael. And like the Zohar says, what does Yisrael mean? Yisrael comes from two words. Li, to me, Roish is a head. In other words, it's referring to the idea of a head. Not only a head, but li, to me, is a head. What does it mean? What does it mean to me is a head? The head of Hashem. So you see that Yaakov is referring to the temporary part of heel. That's why he says oyel. And Yisrael is referring to the head of Hashem, and that's what's connected to the idea of Mishkanesecha. In other words, you see, it's literally polar opposites. On one, and there's no only comparison. On one hand, you're dealing with the heel of Yaakov, the heel of a human being, and the other hand is referring to what? The head of Hashem. And that's why it says, Ahyalecha, when it says about something which is temporary, it's verse about Yaakov, it's referring to the heel of a human being. On the other hand, which is temporary. On the other hand, when it refers to Mishkanei Secha, it says Yisrael, referring to Hashem himself. Now, on both these two levels, whether it's Yaakov, whether it's the transient part of Yaakov, the heel, it's referring to the fact that we're connected to the head of Hashem. On both of them, he says, Ma toivu, how good it is. In other words, both of them are good. And not only is this Ma, Toiv is good, but Ma also, the Rebbe says, there's a lot of Kabbalistic insights to Ma. That Ma is one of the names of Hashem, it's referring to humility, etc. So on both levels, the highest level, Li Roish, which is permanent, the lowest level, which is transient, Yaakov and Yisrael, Ahyalecha and Mishkanei Secha, both of them he says Ma, which is again with all the powerful insights of Ma, which is humility, and Hashem's name, and also Toiv, that it's good. And the Tzemach Tzedek explains in Torah that this is the difference between when a person establishes time to learn Torah of somebody that's really preoccupied with business. So in other words, if someone's preoccupied with business, you sit down to learn Torah. So you sit down at night, you're exhausted before you start your day of work, but you're not doing it in a permanent way. So he says that's the connection of Ahyalecha Yaakov, referring to on a spiritual level. If someone sits down to learn Torah, and it's not his main occupation. And then he says, then there's a learning Torah, someone that's dedicated to learning Torah, someone that's his life is about learning Torah. And that's the level of what Yisrael in a way of permanence. So that's what the Rebbe brings from the Tzemach Tzedek, who explains this beautiful insight based on a teaching of the Maggid of Message. Then the Rebbe goes on to say, and he says as follows. Afterwards, the Tzemach Tzedek writes that the intent of the Chassidic discourse of Matoivu, of the Alter Rebbe and Lakutei Torah, is not so. And he gives a whole different insight, and he says like this. So he explains that the explanation in the verse, like the Alter explains in Lakutei Torah, the difference between Ahyalecha, Yaakov, and Mishkanei Secha Yisrael, based on what it says in another verse in the Torah. What is the other verse in the Torah? So the other verse in the Torah says like this: V'yasisa yeriyos izim, you should make curtains made out of goats, l'oil, for a covering ala mishkan. So you see, it says over there in that verse, you're making an oil, which is a covering ala mishkan on the dwelling place. So he explains like this, that there's two types of coverings for the mishkan. There was the mishkan itself, and then there's the yeriyos that covered it. So we just learned in this verse, this is the yeriyos izim, the covering which is the goat from goat's hair, and then there's the covering which is made out of sheish mazar, like the Torah says, sheish mazar, twined linen. So the sheish mazar, the linen, is referring to the Mishkan itself, and yeriyos izim, the goat, is referring to the idea of oil. So again, to recap, what the Alter is saying in Lakutei Torah, the Alter explains that the idea of oil and Mishkan, he's bringing from a different verse. Where you see oil is referring to the goat's hair, and then the Mishkan is referring to what? The linen. And he explains like this. This is the difference. In other words, the covering of the Mishkan, which is made out of linen, how many coverings were there? So there was 10. However, when it came to the goat's hair, the oil, there was actually 11. So you see again, there's the oil and the Mishkan. One is the goat and one is the linen. But more importantly, the oil is actually 11 and the Mishkan was 10. What's the difference? The Alter explains like this, and he says as follows. The number 11 is referring to our spiritual work of transforming the world. In Hebrew, it's called avodas habirurim, to transform the sparks in the world. But what type of sparks? The sparks of klipat noiga, which we know, for example, there's 3 levels for this conversation. There's many. One level is holy, which is kadosh, holy, a Torah, a mitzvah, holy things. Then you have, on the other extreme, shalish klipas etmeis, the 3 impure holiness, 3 impure klipot, the opposite of holiness. And then you have klipas noi, that's neutral. So the Rebbe, the Alter explains that the number 11 is referring to the transformation of klipas noiga, the neutral things. Take, for example, simple example, you have food, kosher food. If it's non-kosher, and if it's really, really something which you're not allowed to eat, it goes into the category of 3 impure klipot. But let's say you have something which is kosher. Now, till you eat it, it's neutral. If you make a blessing, you have the right intentions, you elevated it. Out of klipas noigan, you elevate the kedusha. If, God forbid, you don't make a blessing, you don't have the right intentions, you can actually downgrade it. But back to the point is that 11 is referring to the transformation of klipas noiga. Why is that? Because there's something which is called in Kabbalah 11 crowns of klipa. There's 10 crowns of klipa. Eser kisr nemasavusa. There's 10 crowns of klipa, and then there's in the Kabbalah it's called a lavoina, something white which covers over it. So you have 10 impure klipot. You have one that covers over it, that makes it basically 11. And that's connected to the, what's the number 11 we just learned, is referring to the goats here. Now, why is goats connected to the number 11, which is impure klipot? Because goats spiritually is referring to darkness. And the Rebbe brings the famous story in the Talmud says like this: how come when you see a goat walking and you see the sheep behind it, so how come the goat comes first and then the sheep go behind it? And the Talmud says, very simple, because when Hashem created the world, so first it was dark and then it was light. So, and a goat is usually dark, and the sheep are white. So therefore the goat comes first and the sheep go after it. So you see clearly in the Talmud that the goat is connected to darkness. And that's why the goat is connected to the idea of leaven. So again, so Uriah Sizim is referring to what? The goats, which is connected to the 11, and which is completely something that we have to transform. Now, how do we, so we have to transform it, we have work to do. Who transforms it, and how do we transform it? So we transform it through the idea of Yaakov, the spiritual level of Yaakov, which goes down to transform it. So notice, to recap, what the Alter was explaining is, Yaakov, so oil is referring to what? The oil, it was beautiful. The oil, the covering on top of the Mishkan, which is made out of goat, which is referring to 11 klipa something that we have to transform. Who transforms it? Yaakov transforms it. That's what it says. Oyalecha Yaakov. However, when it comes to the Yeriyos, the coverings of the Mishkan, which we said, which was connected to the idea of sheish masar linen, how many was there? 10. What's the idea of 10? 10 holy spheres, kedusha, holiness, and the way it's in a revealed way. And like we learned in Mesechas Avot, and it happens to be when the Rebbe was giving this Chassidic course, that was the one that they learned that week. But it says in Pirkei Avot that with 10 utterances Hashem created the world. Now, so you see again that 10 is connected to holiness. Hashem created the world with 10 utterances. Now the fact is, Hashem created the world with 10. So the world is full of 10 powerful Kedusha elements. But the fact, unfortunately, the world we know comes from, in Hebrew it's called olam, and it's the same letters as helam, concealment. So because we're living in a world where there's concealment, so you have to actually prove that Hashem created the world. But the fact is Hashem did create the world, and you need faith, etc. But that's the power of Mishkanoi Secha. That means Mishkanoi Secha means that dwelling that we reveal in the world, the Mishkan, that's really a dwelling place for Hashem, of 10 seros. And this is actually higher than transforming. And that's why it's the level of Yisrael. So let's recap. What they was explaining with this, the Alter was saying a whole different insight, a beautiful insight, into why it says, Matoiv Alecha Yaakov, Mishkanei Secha Yisrael. So Alecha is referring to the transformation we have to do in the world, the 11, the goat, etc. And that gets done through Yaakov. On the other hand, Mishkanei Secha is referring to the 10 holy elements in the world, the creation of the world by Hashem. And what's our job? Mishkanei Secha Yisrael, to reveal the holiness of Hashem in this world. Now, what does that mean practically? You ever said, we know that we learn Chassidus, it's all about, it's deep stuff, Kabbalah stuff, we all have the Zohar and the 10 and the 11, etc. But you have to explain it, in Hebrew it's called, or in Kabbalistic language, Ba'avodas Adam. How is this going to help us in serving Hashem? Ultimately, you have to serve Hashem. So the Alter brings in the Likutei Torah and he says, this is the difference practically between learning Torah and doing mitzvahs. Why? Because Torah, when you learn Torah, it's like the Mishkan, the dwelling place, which is permanent, which is solid and bringing light into the world, which you're dealing with holiness. Why? Because when you learn Torah, God's revealed. Sit down to learn Torah, you see God in godliness. And like it says, like Chazal teach us, based on the verse, in the prophet that say, Haloi koi dvarei ka'esh. The words of Hashem like fire. In other words, we know the words of Hashem, Torah is like fire, and the fact is, the Torah is not susceptible to any impurity. In other words, not only it can't even become impure, because just like fire is fire. No, fire consumes everything else. Torah consumes everything else, and not only Torah in general, but even when a person sits and learns Torah, when you're learning Torah, you cannot become impure by the learning of the Torah. So you see that what's Torah? Torah is powerful. Torah is Aish. Torah is fire. Torah is godliness revealed in the world. However, when it comes to mitzvahs, where's mitzvahs given? You don't do mitzvahs in the spiritual world. You do mitzvahs in the physical world. Whether it's keeping kosher, it's food, it's filling, so you need to hide from an animal, mezuzahs, and so on. So mitzvahs are given in the physical world. Why was it given into the physical world? Because our job is to transform the world. And therefore, Torah's main avodah is where? In the intellect. In the intellect in our head. However, mitzvahs is where more in the world of action. And that's why it says, Ayalecha Yaakov, O Mishkanaisecha Yisrael. Why is that? Because they have the spiritual work of doing mitzvahs, which is in the world, Oyhel, which is a temporary place, that happens through Yaakov. And we learned Yud Akev, he deals with the heel of the world. Action. Akev is the heel, which is connected to action. On the other hand, the spiritual service of learning Torah, which is connected to Mishkan, drawing down godliness in the world, that's in the level of Yisrael, Li Roish. So you see beautifully, the Rebbe explains another insight, practically, that Matoivoy Lecha Yaakov, when it's referring to going ahead and transforming the world, doing the mitzvahs. So Yaakov, what's the idea of Yaakov? Because it's the heel, it's the world, the physical part of the world. Mishkanei Secha, drawing in God, Yisrael, referring to Li Roish, the idea of bringing in godliness into this world. Now, after the Tzemach Tzedek brings this beautiful insight of the Alter Rebbe L'Kutei Torah, he writes, it's a powerful, and he says like this: it's possible to say this is the reason why an oyhel, a tent, is called a temporary abode, and a mishkan is called a permanent abode. Why? Because we know it says in the Talmud, a person should do your work should be aray. Should not be your main thing. And what should be your real involvement in the world? Torah. So you see Mishkanei Secha, which is connected to making a dwelling place from Hashem, like we learned as Torah. And that's why he says Torah should be your mainstay. Versus doing mitzvahs, which is in the physical world. So that is not the mainstay, and that's that's the connection to the idea of a temporary place. And that Rebbe is going to explain it. He says like this. He's going to explain it even further and even deeper, and trying to combine the two different insights. And he says like this: generally speaking, the situation of a temporary abode for the Jewish people, when is that? Where is that? That's referring to when we are in exile. When we are in exile, Hashem is not revealed in the fullest. The Shekhinah is in Galus, we're in Galus. That is a temporary abode. Why is that? Because Galus, exile, it's not the place for a Jewish person. A Jewish person wants to be in a place where Hashem is revealed. Like, for example, it says in the Talmud that the Jewish people, in the time of exile, we are compared to children that were exiled from their father's table. Every child belongs to be on the table with his parents, by the table. And when a child is not sitting by his parents' table, that's exile for the child. But nevertheless, even in exile, we're still considered Hashem's children. This is not our place. Our place is to be on Hashem's table. And that's why he says in the Talmud, woe to the children that have been exiled from the table of Hashem. So in other words, Galus is not this is not our home. Galus is an oil. Galus is in a temporary abode. And that's why it says, Matoivu, how good oyalecha, the temporary abode of Yaakov. What does that mean? Because even though we're in Galus, oyel, we're in Galus, and we're not where we belong, we're in a temporary place here. Nevertheless, even though we are in Galus, the verse says, Matoivu oyalecha Yaakov. Why? If we're not with Hashem, how's it good? If it's a temporary abode, and he explains beautifully, because in what do we do in Galus? We're not out to lunch, but nevertheless, we're busy with Yaakov. We make a dir b'tachtonim, we do mitzvahs. So we're busy making a dwelling place for Hashem down here. So basically, he explains beautifully, what does it mean? Matoivu oyalecha Yaakov. On one hand, it's a temporary abode, but on the other hand, Matoivu, how good is it? How did it become good? Because Yaakov, we do mitzvahs. And by doing a mitzvah, you make a dwelling place for Hashem down here. And when you make a dwelling for Hashem down here, so you took a place that was a temporary place, and you established it as a permanent home for Hashem. And the Rebbe goes in a step further, and he says something very, very powerful. The intent is not that the whole gullus, the whole exile, is a preparation, or it's going to be like a Mashiach comes. Yeah, true, we're looking forward to Mashiach coming. But it's not that this is a preparation for the future. But literally, as we do our spiritual work in Galus, we make a dwelling place for Hashem right here, right now. Powerful, revolutionary idea what Rebbe is saying is. True, it doesn't take away from we all look for the Mashiach to come, and it's going to be amazing. But the point Rebbe is saying is, even though we're in Galus, it's not our home, but every time we do a mitzvah, and we make a dir b'tachtonim, what we're doing right now is, we are making now a dwelling place for Hashem. We are making it a permanent home for Hashem right now. Like the Rebbe brings from what's brought down in Tanya, the Alter explains, and he says as follows. What's the whole idea of a mitzvah? When you do a mitzvah, and there's 613 of them, 248 positive, 369 negative. Mitzvah is all about tzafsa v'chibur. It's all about creating a connection. Because what kind of connection? Because through a mitzvah, the person doing the mitzvah, we connect with Hashem, the one that gave us the mitzvah. And when we do a mitzvah, we're connecting to Hashem, so we're making a dwelling place for Hashem down here. And based on this, he explains something very beautifully. He says as follows. This is also an explanation of a diras aray, a temporary abode, and a diras kavah, a permanent abode. In other words, seemingly, if it's a temporary abode, it should only be called an oil, a temporary abode. And a permanent place should be called a house. But the fact is, Rebbe says, because he wants to bring out on the contrary, that even in a temporary abode, like Galus, even over there we can make a full-time presence for Hashem. By doing what? Dir v'tachtonim. It's not a contradiction. Even in a diras aray of this world, where it's a temporary abode, we could make a full dwelling place for Hashem in this world. And the same thing also applies about making a permanent place in the tent. Why? Because the fact is, the Mishkan was also a temporary place. But nevertheless, the Mishkan was temporary, it was transient. But nevertheless, what does Hashem say about the Mishkan? V'shachanti b'soicham. I'm going to dwell in there. So even though it was a temporary place, nevertheless, Hashem could and will dwell in there. Now, what does that mean practically? So the Rebbe explains like this. And again, I'll say the words again in Hebrew. Ba'avodas ha'adam. It's all about the way all about how it helps us connect and serve Hashem better. What is the general purpose of us serving Hashem? Knows why are we here? So we have a job description. The general purpose of us serving Hashem, what's our job description? What's our to-do list? Is to go ahead and transform and elevate the sparks of this galus, of this world. That's what we're here for. We are here for one reason only, to transform this world and make it a dwelling place for Hashem. In Hebrew, it's called avodas habirurim, to elevate the sparks that are here. And this world should see one thing and one thing only, that Hashem runs the show. Now, why is that? And there explains like this. When Hashem created the world initially, it was created complete. And that's why, if you look in the Torah, in the beginning of Genesis, it says, Eile toilos hashamayim ba'aretz bibaram. This is the offspring of the heaven and the earth when Hashem created. So toildos could be written with one vav or two vavs, and it's written with two vavs. And in Kabbalah it's called smolei. It's full. Why? Because the world, just like toildos it's full. The world was created complete. The world was 100% complete. Because in the world, the only thing that, when originally Hashem created the world, the only thing that existed in the world was holiness. Or things that served holiness. When Hashem created the world was holy, or things that served holiness. Up to the point, and everything's a beautiful piece from the Talmud. The Talmud says like this. You know the primordial sin with the snake? So it's called the Nachash HaKadmoni, the primordial snake. So it says in the Talmud, a beautiful story, that when they were sitting in heaven, so they were serving Adam, and the Nachash, he was one of the servants up there, and he got jealous. But what do you see from the point of the story of the Talmud? That this Nachash that made all the trouble in the primordial sin, he originally was holy. Jealousy kicked in. Fine, I get it. But originally, the snake wasn't bad. The snake was holy as well. But what happened after the sin, the famous sin? So he was downgraded from his high level, and unfortunately, it became part of the energy of L'Umazeh from the other side, from Klipa, etc. And we have to elevate it. But the point is, Hashem originally created the world 100% complete. Unfortunately, because of the sin, our job is to transform the world and elevate the sparks. So who does that? That's like we learned before already. There's a spiritual work of Yaakov. And we already learned, the Zohar says, Yaakov is made up of Yud, Akev. Yud, Akev, the heel. In other words, you have to get involved in the heel, in the physical part of the world. And to make it an Oyalecha Yaakov. In other words, what does it mean Oyalecha Yaakov? That Yaakov, the heel, becomes a true owner of the world, of the temporary abode, and we make it a dwelling place for Hashem. So again, our general avodah in this world is to elevate the world, to transform the sparks. However, what's the avodah of Yisrael? Li Rosh, the head of Hashem in holiness. And generally speaking, this is the general difference between our spiritual work during the week and Shabbat. And like the author explains at length in the Kutei Torah, and he says like this, in this parsha. During the week, from Sunday to Friday, our job is transforming the lost sparks in the world. We have to deal with the physical world. And that's why it's called an oyel arai, a temporary abode. Because this work of trying to elevate sparks, that's not what we're really here for. The world is created to compete. We have a job to do, but it's an arai, it's temporary. That's the avodah during the week. And what's our spiritual service on Shabbos? Our spiritual service on Shabbos is holiness, only holying. And we know it says in the Talmud that, for example, Rosh Chodesh, you have to sanctify. We know we sanctify the moon every month, etc. Shabbos, there's no sanctification of Shabbos. Why? Because it says in the Talmud, because Shabbos, mekatsha v'kaima. Hashem made it holy and it stays holy. So our avodah on Shabbos is with holy things. It's kadosh. Why? Because that's the place of the Jewish people, the holy people. And the same thing also applies on Yom Tov as well. What's Yom Tov? Yom Tov is called Mikroi Kodesh. Yom Tov is also a holy day. And like it's brought down in the Chassidic Discourse about Yom Tov. And that's why Yom Tov is also called Shabbos. And like we see clearly when it comes to Sfiras HaOmer, it says you should count Mimachras HaShabbos. Why? So you see the Yom Tovim are connected to Shabbos. So you see another beautiful difference between during the week and Shabbos. During the week our avodah is transforming the world, Yaakov. Shabbos our avodah is Yisrael dealing with holiness. Now, these two spiritual works of Oyel, the temporary abode, and the Mishkan, the permanent abode, which we learned before again is arai, temporary and permanent, or the idea of Torah, which is the permanent, and mitzvahs, which is the temporary part. So it's connected to what it says in the beginning of the verse, Ma toivu oyalecha, how good it is. And obviously, what does the word literally mean? That the tents of Yaakov and the dwelling place of the Jewish people, they were there before. You know, it's not that it was the tents were created, Yaakov or Yisrael was created. It was there before already. The verse is saying is, Ma toivu. What does it mean, Ma toivu? How good it is. What does it mean, good it is? Both of them. What did we burn? Because we already learned. There's two different avodas here. There's the Yalecha Yaakov, dealing with the physical world, transforming the world, Umishkanei Sacha Yisrael, learning Torah. Both of those avodas, both spiritual work, whether it's learning Torah, doing mitzvahs, dealing with the world, elevating the world, or bringing godly light into the world, they're both on the level of Ma, one of the names of Hashem, and also the level of good. And not only that, or even more, the Rebbe says, that, and this is very powerful, we learned there's two different avodas, learning Torah and doing mitzvahs. Temporary abode and the permanent abode. So they're both ma toivu. But deeper the Rebbe says, it doesn't say ma toivu for this one, ma toivu for that one. It says once ma toivu for both of them. In other words, because one ma toivu, how good is it for both of them? Why? Because both of them, and this is very powerful, together are on the same level. And they're both on the level of good. So you can't say it's more important to learn Torah, more important to do mitzvahs. No, it says ma toivu, Ahilecha Yaakov Mishkan Yisrael. They're both good, and they're both on the same level of goodness. So the Rebbe is saying is something beautiful, and he's saying is they're both two different avodas, but they're both good and both equally as good. And the Rebbe finishes off and he says like this: it should be the will of Hashem that when we do our spiritual work in all these things that we learned before, learning Torah, doing mitzvahs, making this world a dwelling place for Hashem, will come to, very, very soon, to fulfill Mishkanei Sacha Yisrael, that we're going to have the dwelling place of the Torah of Hashem himself in this world in a way that's going to be permanent. And how's it going to be permanent? We're going to have the third base of Mikdash, the third temple, which is going to be a permanent dwelling place, much greater than the first two bases of Mikdash that we had. Like Rashi says clearly, based on the verse, Hashem yimloich li'olam voed, Hashem is going to be the king forever and ever, because then we're going to have the Bayis Nitzchi, the Beis Mikdash, which is going to be everlasting, which includes in the everlasting third Beis Mikdash also the first two Beis Mikdash. Like it says in Chazal on the verse, Eilep Kudei HaMishkan. This is the counting of the Mishkan. It says twice, Mishkan Eid is twice Mishkan. In other words, that both Beis HaMikdash goes into the category of Mishkan. So we see that when the third Beis HaMikdash is going to come back, and it's going to be revealed, what's going to be revealed then is also the Mishkan of Moshe Rabbeinu, which we know is everlasting, and it's all going to come back. The third Beis Mikdash will have for new, and the first and the second and the Mishkan is all going to come back. It's going to come back when Mashiach Tzidkenu, the righteous Mashiach, is going to come, and like the Rebbe finishes off, Bimheira B'Yameinu Mamish, it's going to happen very, very soon and very, very quickly. Another beautiful Chassidic discourse about how great the Jewish people are, learning Torah, doing mitzvahs, they're both important. And the Rebbe says, as we do it, we will make a dir b'tachtonim, and let's hope and pray that we make a real dwelling place for Hashem. And God willing, our next class will be in Yerushalayim, Ir HaKodesh. Have a great and blessed week. Shavua Tov.